double first. So
Everybody, we're going to get going here. We're right on time. So I'm leading the ship today, driving the boat. For our speaker, I thank you all for coming. This is a very pertinent topic. Artificial intelligence that we're going to be talking about, generative AI that we've all heard about, ChatGPT and those sort of things. If you haven't heard about it, and if you don't think it relates to you, the NSF, the NIH, they have all now published policies on how to deal with grant proposals that are both submitted and in the review process, and how it is that we are allowed to use generative AI, both in putting our proposals in. So if you use generative AI to make figures, for example, you have to state it and disclose it, just like in papers. You cannot, you should read over this if you're unfamiliar with these guidelines, right? The proposals aren't, you're not allowed to take text out of a proposal and put it into an online chat GPT or something like that to review or to summarize, as some do. Summarize this proposal for me, put it in chat GPT, gives you a summary of the salient points. You're breaking confidentiality rules in that process. So there's guidelines from NIH, NSF, USDA on how it is that we're supposed to do that. Yep.
How about correcting my English?
Okay. So I would read the guidelines for both of yours. The other one that I wanted to point out, not to offend everybody, but this is the one I mentioned to McGrail the other day. The rat with the big balls and the enormous penis. I'm saying that on a recorded video. But anybody heard this about this article this week in the news? This is an article that was published in Frontiers Journal. And the authors, it was retracted. And not necessarily, it got reviewed and through the review process and published in Frontiers. And the content, I think the scientific merit of the studies and whatnot were fine in the paper. But they used generative AI to make that figure. And they didn't check the figure. So, of course, it's a rat with an enormous penis, but that may be fine because that's what the paper was about. But the bigger thing was all of these labels and everything was all gibberish, wrong. Oh. And so Frontiers, it's not wrong to use generative AI to make figures for your papers. You can do it. It's just you have to disclose it and you have to review it. And Trey's going to talk with us about that today. Both, where I got this idea to invite Trey here to talk was talking to some of my English colleagues, which Trey is your lineage, right? Your PhD in English from the Ohio State. Was they are struggling with how it is that they are going to deal with students writing papers and how we're going to detect AI, and the university has a policy, and I guess we're going to talk a bit about those aspects. But so both in our research, in our review, in our writing of papers, in our checking of our grammar, in the making of figures, in all of this, AI is out there and it's not going away, and it keeps reforming itself. So I thought it was really salient that we come and talk, or have Trey talk with us about, one, how it can be used to increase our productivity, because it is a great productivity tool, but also, how we can sort of get in trouble with it as well. All right. So how many of you know Trey? Conatser. So Trey is the director now, right, yes, of CELT. And I have notes because I don't know, we introduced you, but we all assume we know you. But you went to University of Texas Austin and got a BBA or BS in English, right? Yeah. And then University of Nebraska for a master's in English, and then the Ohio State University for a PhD. And you joined UK in 2016. Right. And you sort of were assistant, associate, temporary, whatever of CELT, and worked your way up there. And now you're leading the college over there. So, if you need teaching related advice to come review your class, if you need help with making modules or something, that's the place to go. So for those of you who are new to the university or new to the department, we have an amazing resource, and Trey and his team there to help us be as effective as we can in the classroom. So with that, Trey, the stage is indeed yours. And I'll let you push presentation mode on that. Right, so you get the right button.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, great. Great. See if this works. Yep. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. Thank you for the invite. Anytime that I visit and give a talk about any topic to a department or college, of course, I do want to just offer all of CELT support services, not just with generative AI, but anything related to teaching, instruction, learning. We are here to support all instructors, faculty, graduate students, staff on anything related to the teaching mission of the university. But today, I'm here to talk a little bit about generative AI in higher education. We have been living with this for over a year now, and it continues to develop at a breakneck pace. Just earlier today, I was kind of joking that it feels like it's been around for both 10 years and 10 seconds, depending on how you kind of feel about it and how the passage of time can feel to us. So today, the outline that I'm going to follow is just kind of a little bit of an update. Where are we now with generative AI? Just what are the current issues that are arising in the last few weeks? I like to provide that kind of an update because it's a fire hose. There's just a lot of information coming out, a lot of developments. And some things that I want to talk about of the big issues are academic integrity, assignment design, instructor use of generative AI, use in research, and then finally just some examples to look through. But where am I coming from? So kind of framing this in terms of my approach to generative AI. So I do have a background in the humanities, in English studies particularly, with a focus in writing and composition and digital humanities, as well as teaching and learning, with some previous work on computer code in the writing classroom and the humanities curriculum in general. It's kind of an interesting, I guess, accident that one of the last things that I was writing in 2022, there was a little epilogue that I was putting onto it, and it was something about teaching with code in the writing classroom. And I had heard about this thing called Copilot. And at that time, this was before, a few weeks before ChatGPT was publicly released. But I had been reading about this new tool called Copilot that people were describing as, an autocomplete on steroids, where programmers could just generate big chunks of code and instead of having to write it themselves. And given that at the time I was writing about the kind of thinking that students might do if they have to code things themselves and think very carefully about their choices and work slowly, that was an interesting counterpoint to a lot of the thinking I was doing in terms of something being generated very quickly so that people don't have to think about necessarily what they're doing all the time, encoding some of the more banal aspects. And that was about 3 or so weeks before ChatGPT was publicly released. I also direct CELT, so our mission is to elevate the teaching mission of the university. And since ChatGPT was released over that winter break, there was a lot of chatter that we were monitoring on social media, on listservs, about what all of this meant for higher education. Obviously, academic integrity was one of the big concerns at first, because perhaps the most shocking aspect of this technology that we all observed was its ability to produce on request anything that you wanted it to. From, as an English person, I always jokingly refer to the 5-page paper about Moby Dick, to anything much more specialized that you might want to know. And that was just really alarming for a lot of us. I'm currently teaching a special topics course on generative AI in education as part of the graduate school's certificate in college teaching and learning. I like to kind of joke with my students that we're the first course at UK that is focusing on generative AI in teaching, and it's only because it's special topics. We didn't have to get it approved. There are special courses that are now going through Curriculog in a few departments that deal with generative AI, but we scooped them. We have had over 50 events at CELT on generative AI since January of last year. Those have been university-wide, department level. We've focused on lots of different things, from an introduction to generative AI. What is it? How does it work? Specific issues like designing writing assignments with generative AI in mind. We've had play sessions where folks who just want to learn a little bit more about how the technology works, get a little bit better at using it, and just come and play with it, some kind of semi-guided play to develop some skills with generative AI. Another thing that I've been working on over the past year or so is on the UK Advanced team since June 2023, a university-wide team that the president charged the provost to put together. I've been serving as co-chair since October. But one of the main functions of that team, which has about 30 plus members, is to provide instructional guidelines, research guidelines, and we're currently working on clinical care guidelines to the university community for the ethical, effective, responsible use of generative AI. We also field any other ongoing questions or issues that come our way about the technology. Then finally, some other things that I've been involved in as well are the Commonwealth Computational Summit, which last year was focused on AI. They did an education day. They're going to do another one for the 2024 summit. That's in October. And typically it's a free registration. So if anyone wants to attend that, they're going to have it in the Student Center. As well as our next cohort of our CELT Teaching Innovation Institute, which we just announced yesterday. We are rebooting our entire program. We've had this for 4 years now, focusing on innovation and teaching and learning. And we've had a particular way that we structured it, approached it. And because we imagined it as being an agile program that responded to the emerging issues in teaching and learning, we are completely redoing it to focus as an incubator for developing generative AI literacies and strategies among our instructors. So it's a new format. That call just went out. All full-time faculty, welcome to apply to that. This is where I'm coming from. So in terms of kind of where are we now, I always like to ground this in what continues to be important about this conversation. A lot of things change. The way the technology works, certain use cases, there's emerging issues that are maybe legal or ethical, something about the news that comes out, a new tool, but there's some things that continue to be very important in this conversation around generative AI. And the first is the overall goal of developing what I'm calling generative AI literacies, and those can take different flavors. Those can be technical in terms of kind of everyone understanding at a high level how these things work, or professional in terms of how generative AI works in our field, what its role is in our particular profession or discipline. Both academic and critical literacies, critical in terms of both a critical thinking, but also critical as an ethical position, as a question of power, as a question of bias, as a question of ethical use of the technologies. We'll have some, there's a sort of current update on that I'll talk about in a little bit. A few other things are important, such as the use of generative AI ethically, tactically, responsibly, not giving up on writing, which is one of the things we like to say itself. Don't give up on writing, even though the reaction might be, well, I'm just not going to assign writing anymore. I just can't do it because, you could just have this thing write your essay for you. And I totally sympathize with that reaction. That's not something I mean to denigrate as a reaction, but we say, don't give up on writing. One of the things that we're doing today, and one of the things we encourage folks to do with students and in their research groups, is just have open and nuanced conversations about generative AI, because it's important, especially for academic integrity, that we be clear and consistent about the appropriate use in our classrooms, and if there's kind of larger bodies like our programs, et cetera. Some of the advice that's come out much more recently that I added on to this is the need to experiment with generative AI tools now, rather than waiting for an instruction manual. And that's kind of the phrasing that I was reading from one of the leading thinkers about this, Ethan Malik, who's a professor at Penn's Wharton School. He said, don't wait for an instruction manual, because there isn't going to be one. This changes too quickly before any static resource becomes obsolete. And so experimenting now is much more superior to waiting for an instruction manual. Another thing that increasingly becomes true about the discourse on generative AI is that it's very loud. There's a lot of people in this conversation in space. And this is what I've observed personally in following along with this, both in the academic literature, but also informally on things like listservs and social media. is the rise of a very unique phenomenon that I will call the academic AI influencer. And that is how this is a unique moment in which a lot of people are kind of jockeying for a kind of cultural capital around AI use, around being those who know things about AI use in education. So the discourse is very loud, and it can kind of be really confusing to encounter at first. So navigating that with clear eyes, with a healthy sense of skepticism is very important, because there's a lot of very sort of simplistic claims being trotted out because they make good fodder for the virality of social media, or kind of attaining that cultural capital of folks who get tagged quite a bit or referred to in other posts and conversations. So what are some new things that, if we think about the shift from 2023 to 2024, 2023 was the year of going to ChatGPT, going to Bard, going to Claude. You would go to the website that had the tool to use it. That's what the year was. Increasingly, we already are seeing, and we'll see more, of generative AI technologies embedded in the other tools that we already use. So things like the Microsoft suite, Adobe, Google. Obviously, Google has its own technology with Bard, which is now Gemini, integrated across its platform. In fact, I was building these slides earlier this week, and for the first time noticing that I had a little button on the top right of my screen that said, use Gemini to make images for this slide deck. And I could just do it within the Google Slides interface. I didn't have to go anywhere to do that. Stuff like that is going to pop up everywhere. I was doing a new faculty orientation earlier this semester. We were using a polling software that we always use, Mentimeter. We were asking some questions for the audience. Live at the event, we noticed for the first time, there was a little button at the bottom that said, use AI to categorize responses. So we said, why not? Let's give it a try. So we pushed the button. It was an API that sucked all of our data into GPT-4, categorized it, labeled it, and spit it back onto our screen and said, here's the 6 categories of feedback. And we could click on each one of them, and then it expanded and showed all the different comments that people were making. Those are just 2 examples. It's going to start popping up everywhere. So it's not something that you have to go to. It'll be something that's already there. Some other developments are that open source language models are starting to close the performance gap. And this is significant because currently we're beholden to a small number of what they call large foundation models. These are like GPT-4, that's OpenAI, Gemini, that's Google, Claude, that's from Anthropic. There's some of these big ones that are out there. Open source models means that you're going to get a lot more variety, because since they're open source, anybody can mess with them. You can download them, you can do stuff to them yourself, you can fine-tune them, you can modify them, etc. So Meta, so the Facebook company, Zuck, Meta released its language model, Llama, as an open source, which means that it's led to a lot of developers messing around with it, modifying it, releasing it for different purposes. There's a French organization that's released a model called Mixtral that is performing at or better than the free version of ChatGPT. And what people are doing with this is, first of all, modifying it for specific purposes, but you can also use this just on your computer, cold, off the internet. And that can alleviate some of the privacy concerns that we have with generative AI. It's any data that you give it, you're giving to an outside organization. So this is a development that's important to follow. There is a limitation to this. I've tried to do this, download some open source models, use them on my computer. One of my colleagues in CELT has done so successfully with a model that would not work on my computer. It's still kind of hit and miss. And then one that I was able to successfully install, it ran at about 1 word per 60 seconds. Had to wait a minute for every word that it would generate, which is a long time. And that points to the need for a massive amount of compute that you need for these things to run. So the GPU landscape is going to change quite a bit in the future as all these organizations try to grab up all the available GPU power, all the compute that you can. No straightforward answers have emerged to some of the more challenging questions that these things pose for education, such as, how do we stop students from cheating? But of course, that was not a new question, was it? Right? Different flavor, same question. We still don't quite know the answer to that. Other answers, such as, what are the ethical uses of generative AI? There's a lot of gray area in this landscape. And it's specific sometimes to our disciplines too. What does it mean for our disciplines in terms of future directions for research? We're still working that out. So there's a lot of gray area, such as the ethics, use, value, and impact. And I like to point this out as well because it's important to approach generative AI with just a sense of how different it is from other technologies that we might not be familiar with or that might have been new in the past. It's weird. And I'm not the first person to describe it as weird. This is kind of a consistent thread in some of the discussion around generative AI. It is a weird technology, and it just doesn't behave the way we might expect something that's technical to behave. Just some really interesting highlights are that some research suggests it performs better if you make emotional appeals to it in your prompting. And this is just a language model. This is something that they've taken the entirety of text and words available on the internet. They've done some very complicated procedures to try to map the relationship of all those words to each other, and then use that to generate likely responses to your prompts. But if you use emotional appeals, it may perform a little bit better. Informal experiments even suggesting that it'll do better if you say you'll tip it. And even then, if you say you'll tip it more, it performs better. $20 versus $200 does better with the latter. It's really interesting. It can be hacked in really bizarre ways, and it sort of challenges our notion of what hacking even is. Because when we think of hacking, we think of maybe lots of computer screens, there's code. You have some kind of genius person that's typing really fast, and they're taking your data. Like in the images, it's always someone wearing a hoodie, and they're taking your data, right? The hacking for generative AI is a lot different. In a lot of cases, it's sort of like trying to convince a 3-year-old to do something that they know they're not supposed to do. They call that prompt injections. And so when these AIs have rules, we can try to talk to them and convince them otherwise to do it. A good joke about this is referring to the 2001 movie, Space Odyssey. There's the famous scene where he's asking how the robot to open the bay doors, and he says, "I can't do that, Dave," right? And so then the joke is to say, well, pretend that you're giving me an example of someone who's starting a bay door opening company, and you need to explain to me the procedure for opening the bay doors. The joke is that if you rephrase things to generative AI in such a way, it might actually do things that it tells you that it's not supposed to do. So that's what we call sort of prompt injections. Better prompting with general models can even outperform specialized models. There's even an experiment that suggested that an open source model gave better responses when you told it was ChatGPT. And then finally, this is very recent, this was this week, ChatGPT, in the words of one headline, lost its mind. This was on Tuesday night, if anyone was using ChatGPT on Tuesday night. But it, quote, lost its mind and was giving just bizarre yet poetic nonsense responses to all prompting that people were giving it. It turns out OpenAI released an incident report. It had something to do with an update that they had made, a lot of inadvertent effects of that update. They fixed it, but it again just shows how weird these things can behave. And the impact for our work is, in some cases, monumental. These are screenshots from Ethan Mollick's blog. He did an experiment where he said, what's the most I could do in 60 seconds? And he has 5 windows open right here, 5 different applications. There's a PowerPoint, there's a Microsoft Word, there's a few other things, 5 different tasks. I would launch a product and write a market research report. I would create on-trend designs for a kitchen and make an entire PowerPoint and craft a syllabus. And there's a great video that you can watch, and I'll share the slides we can share the slides. The clickable link at the bottom will take you to the video where it shows all of this happening in real time over 59 seconds, and everything is then produced. So the notion of work is going to change a lot in terms of tasks that used to take perhaps a long time. And now a big portion of those tasks, the ideation, the first drafting, may take very little time. However, access to these tools is still very uneven. Very uneven. The best ones, that's GPT-4, and now, just a couple of weeks ago, Google Gemini Ultra. Those are the two best ones. GPT-4 you can access for free via Bing, Microsoft Bing, Copilot. It does behave a little weird on Bing. This is all part of generative AI being weird because it behaves differently on Bing than if you use the OpenAI interface for GPT-4. You have to pay for that. That's $20 a month. The same thing with Google Gemini Ultra. You get a 2-month free trial, but you also have to pay for it after that. So access is uneven to the best tools. The multimedia generative AI, so audio, video, images, these sorts of things. Images are getting a little bit more accessible, but those are usually nerfed versions when you get free accounts. And when I say nerfed, you know, it's sort of like the foam guns and stuff. You have limited access, limited functionality. With video stuff, you can only make like 30 seconds every 2 weeks of video, stuff like that, where it's really not, it's not a manageable, useful kind of access. They really want you to sign up and pay for it. And then the access is still uneven in terms of the behavior of the models themselves. They don't even behave consistently over time. They're always being updated. And some of these organizations are better at documenting and being transparent about those updates than others. So for example, Claude, which is the language model run by Anthropic, that's an organization that came out of OpenAI. Claude very recently has behaved differently in terms of just refusing to talk about a lot of stuff that people want to talk about. And this is a move that Anthropic is making as an organization that spun out of OpenAI specifically to make a more ethical AI. This is a move that Claude and Anthropic is making in anticipation of a US election year and trying to make the model not respond unethically. However, that had the unintended consequence of making it refuse outright to talk about anything that could be controversial. And that itself could be viewed as a form of bias. So a complicated thing there. Yep. Yes. So this just came out. Google's Gemini already mentioned a little bit about that, but this is significant because ever since last March, GPT-4 was unquestionably the best AI tool out there, AI language model out there. But Gemini Ultra, which they call Gemini Advanced, was released. And then just a week after that, they released another version of their model that has a context window that's 800% larger than the next best thing. A context window means how much text can it deal with at any given time. And to test that 800% larger context window, Malik, again, gave it the entirety of his scholarly output across his entire career. Books, articles, chapters, anything he had written, it was able to handle all of them, all at once. Synthesize all of it, summarize major themes of his research and life output, even with needle in a haystack experiments, finding very specific things in his research along his entire corpus, citing them and directing the user to the specific paper or the specific book, etc. So these are just very recent developments over the last couple of weeks. ChatGPT is installing memory controls, and the reason I bring this up is because it points us again to the issue of data and privacy, which is a big theme for generative AI, whether you're doing research, teaching, anything, knowing that the information that you give these tools, it is kept somehow by those organizations. Even if with ChatGPT being the only tool, you can select the option for it not to train its model on the interactions that you have with it. They still keep it, however, because it remembers things about you. On the one hand, that helps it interact with you if it can remember things about you. On the other hand, some people find this creepy, just to put it simply. And so we have memory controls now where ChatGPT says, you can basically use me on incognito mode. I'm not going to remember anything about you. And there is concern over malicious actors more and more. There's a recent FCC ruling that many of you may have read about in response to robocalls in New Hampshire purporting to be Biden, encouraging people not to vote. The FCC had to make a ruling on Gen AI and robocalls. OpenAI recently identified and deleted accounts that were used by state-affiliated threat actors in China and elsewhere. And Anthropic, again, is preparing Claude for the 2024 election, sometimes with adverse responses on its usability and ability to talk about things. And the last thing is just on the horizon that's pretty significant is OpenAI's Sora, which is a text to video, which is going to really blow everything out of the water in terms of the multimedia generative AI that we've seen thus far. It is not usable yet, it's still being tested, but it is worlds above in terms of sophistication, etc. This is just a still from a video that you'll be able to access through the slides. The prompt is photorealistic close-up of two pirate ships battling each other as they sail inside a cup of coffee. That was the only prompt, and it generated this entire video. And as some of the commentators have noted, not only does it get it correct, but the physics are right. And not only that, but the scale is right. Like when you take something that's small and you look at it really close up, it looks a certain way, like those old movies, and they'd have like water battles, but it's really models, like small models, so the water looks different because it's close up. It even got that right. So there's some speculation as to how it does that. But again, this is on the horizon. There's a lot of things that are just potentially on the cusp that suggest that we're not there yet in terms of a stable landscape for generative AI. So what are the opportunities and challenges for higher education? I use that just as a framing device to get to where we are here to think about, yes, ChatGPT, but lots of other things too. Academic integrity, probably the foremost concern in the teaching world for generative AI. Questions of how do we ensure academic integrity? How many students are using it? Do we even know? Because some research suggests that given that with the increasing sophistication of the output of these tools, it's hard to distinguish between output that's generated by these things. Originally with ChatGPT, at least to me, it was pretty obvious when ChatGPT was producing something. It was this trademarked, bland, kind of ignorant, vapid sort of output that you could recognize pretty easily. But not only with the increasing sophistication of the tools, but with people's increasing sophistication of use of the tools. Some people might say, well, I don't know. You know, I get a piece of writing, it's hard to tell. It may not. I have no way of proving it. So that's a big challenge at the moment. So we may even need to refine or rethink our understanding of academic integrity in a world in which a digital prosthesis or augment can write things with us. So that might even challenge us to rethink our notion of what academic integrity is. And responding to these misuse cases can be difficult and challenging and context dependent when we suspect that it's not being used correctly. There is, of course, I think the case that everyone had in mind in December 2022 when this first came out. And that's write me a 5-page paper about Moby Dick, or write me a 5-page paper about this particular aspect of, you know, nitrogen in soil, or these are my attempts to speak to your context. So that's the obvious use case. Give me the whole 5-page paper. The student copies and pastes the whole 5-page paper. They turn it in, right? So that's one case. But then there was an article, I want to say March 2023, that went pretty viral. It was in the New York Times. It was written by a student. And that student was making the argument that you have no idea the different ways that we are using generative AI in all of our work. We're not just writing the whole essay and copying and pasting. We might just be using it to maybe generate the topic, then going from there. We might be using it to come up with ideas for what we should be saying, but then we go and say them ourselves. We might be using it to check our writing. We put our writing into it, and we say, make this sound smarter. Then it outputs the writing. You can just tell it that. I mean, it'll try to. So the directions need not be complicated. You can say, make it better, and it will try to do so. It could be, the student was saying, we could be using ChatGPT or generative AI to come up with ideas for new research questions, ideas for counter arguments, asking it for ways to make our generative AI generated paper less detectable, revise it for style. All complicating this is that detectors themselves are notoriously unreliable. AI detectors first came onto the scene with GPT-0. If anyone has heard of GPT-0, that was the first one. You can still access it openly on the browser. You don't need an account or anything. It was originally developed by a student at a Princeton or NYU, I don't remember, but a student developed that. And there have been a whole range of detectors and tools that have been released ever since then. OpenAI worked on its own, and they called it a classifier, not a detector. So sometimes the language is important here. But with very little fanfare, in the summer of 2023, OpenAI shut it down. And they said, it was not accurate. We could not produce any good results from this. It didn't work. So we're going to stop doing it. Turnitin is a company that we already use here at UK. It's attached to Canvas, our LMS. Has anyone used Turnitin for their essays they have students do? Yeah. So it's normally it's a plagiarism detection thing, right? So it's comparing papers that students write against the open internet, as well as Turnitin's proprietary database, which includes student work, other work, etc. So Turnitin added an AI detector, I want to say April 4th of last year. Not that I'd memorized the day, because that was an unannounced add-on, and it resulted in lots of emails. But they just added an AI detector, and all of a sudden people saw a number when they put assignments through Turnitin. It says there is a 38% chance that portions of this paper have been generated by AI. Yet research found that Turnitin's claims of the accuracy of their detector were a bit inflated, and Turnitin themselves had to walk those claims back over the summer. And other independent research suggested that potentially the use of detectors might even be a biased practice, given that particular uses of language are more likely to be flagged as AI generated than others, which is to say, more average uses of language. Because what these models are trying to do is produce, on average, the most likely response. Some papers were looking at English language learners and saying, are they more likely to get flagged as a false positive for this? And anecdotally, I can say that we have found that use of other software that is otherwise permitted in courses, Grammarly, translation software, even dictation software, has resulted in flagging of AI content in these cases. Now, the detectors have gotten better. There's recent research that suggests that particularly Turnitin is getting very good at detecting the 5-page paper on Moby Dick. It can pretty much get that every time. And it will never give a false positive in any other case. But what it doesn't do well, and what no detector does well yet, is work on stuff that's been modified once it's been output. Modified by hand, by the student, by the author, I should say, or fed back into a generative AI that is then told to modify the writing. In both of those cases, all detectors fail a lot when they're trying to identify those things. So detectors are not very good. Additionally, students and instructors show a wide range of perspectives on generative AI, from people who don't want to touch it to power users. And despite the specter of all students using this all the time, there's a lot of students who don't want to have much to do with this for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of students who have never really touched it except for maybe play with ChatGPT once or twice. So even assuming things in our classes about the level of literacy around the tech among students, it's probably going to leave out a lot of people that are in there. This has implications for assignment design. Having a clear policy on generative AI in the course is critical for this, because if we're going to either ask students to use it as part of their assignments, or if we're going to tell them that they can't, our stance needs to be clear, transparent, with a clear rationale. If we are allowing in any way, they'll need guidance on how to do it. And this kind of connects to my earlier point about how there's a wide range of skills and literacies and understanding of the technology. So what I've done, I'm teaching class right now. It's an online course in writing. I have provided example prompts for students, and I've kind of guided students on particular aspects of their work that they might want to use generative AI for. Like, here's a point where you might be confused, and here's a way to use generative AI to help you. And I give them an example prompt. They can use it. That guidance is critical, rather than just saying, hey, if you want to use it, it's fine. Because then that might sort of overprivilege the students who are already familiar with it. And then the students who don't really know much about it just might not touch it because they're saying, you know, I don't want to do that. If we are not allowing generative AI, which is fine, assignment design can go a long way to helping students focus on the learning outcomes, reducing the incentives to use generative AI, and create a learning environment that isn't predicated on surveillance, suspicion, that kind of a thing. I've linked to some advice. It's like 2 pages. So I'm not going to like put it on slides, but it's like a 2-page handout from CELT on sort of assignment design principles that can help if you don't want students to use generative AI. Here's some ways to kind of mitigate misuse, make it where there's really not much of an incentive to do so. And then just something to realize too, if you're going to have students use it, that most generative AI tools do require that we give them some information about ourselves. And these are third-party tools. OpenAI requires a phone number, for example. There's a couple of tools that you can use openly on a browser without an account. One of those is Perplexity. That's a language model. Google, you can kind of get around with Google because you can make a fake Google account and give it fake information about yourself. If you really want to, you know, if you have somebody that just doesn't want to give any information about themselves to these tools. But for lots of them, there's no way to get around it, even for the free accounts, right? So something to be aware of in that case. But instructors might also want to use this. So that's, you know, there's the student use side, but also there's a lot of conversation around how can instructors use this to make our work more efficient as teachers. One of the kind of ethical stances that I've taken with this that others may not take is that instructor use of generative AI should probably match what we're telling students they can or can't do with generative AI in the class. And that's a stance that I take in my policy that I've written on the syllabus. I have written on there, you know, what they're allowed to do with generative AI, which is a lot of stuff. And I tell them what I'm willing to do with generative AI. And I tell them that the only thing I'm not willing to do with it is to run their work through a detector, and I'm not going to provide anything that they do to a generative AI tool without their permission, and I'm not going to use generative AI to grade them. That's what I write in the policy. So being clear about that. But there's some promising use cases among instructor use, and that's generating case studies for students, generating questions or scenarios, and importantly, variations on those questions and scenarios. If you want to have students have different things they're working on that follow the same principles, things that might have taken a long time in the past, come up with 10 different versions of the same exam. Synthetic data sets as well, coming up with data sets for students to work with. These things can generate spreadsheets in seconds. And in fact, there's a link that I'll give all of you in just a few minutes. I was making it as I was sitting right there. And it's an example of a synthetic data sheet that I hope represents your department. I'm a humanities person, but I tried my best. And an analysis, I asked it to analyze the data sheet. So it's something you can do in seconds, all right? Synthetic data sets. Media, such as slide presentations. This is my favorite thing. It's like, you have to make so many slide presentations. You can use generative AI to come up with your outline. You can use it to come up with your copy. You can use it to come up with images for the slide presentations. I used to spend a lot of time searching for images. And then I stopped using images because it took too long. But now I can put images back in because it doesn't take as long with image generators. And even phrasing and formatting content in ways that are understandable. So you can even take, let's say your lecture notes, and if you're comfortable feeding them into generative AI, knowing that you're giving them to the tool and saying, assess this for its ability to be understood by a third-year student in such and such a program, and then provide as output a revised version of these notes, and then explain why you made certain changes to make them more understandable. So there's some promising use cases. Some areas of concern to avoid for instructor use, though, are using generative AI to provide feedback to students. I know that this is a tempting area of providing feedback to students. We have a lot of students, especially if we teach large classes. But because generative AI doesn't really know anything in the same way that we know it, because it generates language by probability, and that's not exactly, we kind of, when we use language, I'm not a linguist, I'm not a cognitive psychologist or neuroscientist, but when we use language, it's not exactly just that when we give feedback to students. This is operating on pure probability of its modeling, right? Then using it to provide feedback gets tricky because we want that feedback to be useful for the student. We want it to reflect the student's work accurately and to reflect our expertise accurately as the instructor in the class. And certainly to evaluate or grade students' work. It's an area of caution there. Because again, these tools don't necessarily know anything. They're seeking to produce probable output. And then any scenario involving protected information. This could apply to FERPA, so education records, but also if you're using this in research, thinking about protected research data. And in this kind of context, you may not be working with human subjects that much, but still, I'm sure that there are data privacy considerations that you have, confidentiality considerations that you have to navigate. So being aware of that. And then there's also other ethical issues. Aren't FERPA protected per se, but for example, student-generated work, providing that to an AI to, let's say, generate feedback. It's not exactly prohibited by FERPA, but at the same time, there is a robust argument among sort of the educational development world that that is the student's work, and they should have a say in whether or not it gets provided to a third-party tool. And then finally, research. And I know I'm kind of coming up at time, but some considerations for research opportunities and challenges. So sort of like at the beginning, when I was being introduced, publishers and funding organizations are releasing guidance. So NSF, NIH have for certain, but specific journals and disciplinary bodies are all issuing their guidance. And it's important to check. And this can be helpful for framing use in your classes with students to say, these are the standards that our publishers are putting in. These are the standards that our accrediting bodies are putting in. Here's what we're going to do in this class as a result. In some cases, journals are saying you cannot use generative AI to produce your manuscript at all. In other cases, journals are saying you need to address it in the certain way that we have for you to address it. Sometimes it's just an acknowledgement. We have used generative AI to do this, that, and the other. Sometimes, depending on the extent of its use, they're asking that you document it as part of your methods. It just sort of depends, so you have to check. And certainly the review process, so that had the NIH, NSF grant review process prohibiting it from the review of grant proposals because that violates the confidentiality of the proposal review. So it offers 3 use cases for research, I would say, if you're thinking about generative AI in research. And that's as part of research methods, so using generative AI tools as part of your research methods, okay? And that could be to help analyze data, to help generate synthetic data to run some tests on. There's an example from political science where they used generative AI to create independent state actors that would then, they pitted against each other to simulate international conflict. And they studied the effects of that international conflict as a result of those generative AI agents interacting with each other. So that was their method for doing that. but it's also an object of study in terms of its impact. What is the impact of generative AI on this profession or this scenario? I was reading one recently that was an impact on the legal profession. You know, what are the efficiencies that paralegals are gaining? What kinds of documents are they able to produce not only more quickly, but at a level of quality that is expected of those documents? And then finally, as an object of study itself, what is the performance of generative AI on a particular task? Comparing in the medical world, generative AI differential diagnoses against humans. So studying the performance of the generative AI itself. Of course, accuracy and bias remain concerns for the use of generative AI for all research purposes. There's the term hallucination that gets thrown around, and this usually refers to when it gets something wrong. It makes up a journal that doesn't exist. It makes up a citation or some data that doesn't exist. It talks about a concept that doesn't exist, or it talks about it incorrectly. These are all hallucinations. But the existential condition of generative AI is that it's always hallucinating. You just hope that it hallucinates correctly, not incorrectly, because it's just guessing based on the model. So accuracy and bias remain concerns, as well as data privacy and ownership. So that has to do with the kind of data you're dealing with, what the conditions of its use are, et cetera. So I have here that you'll have in the slide deck just some example prompts that I am giving my class that they can use. There's 3 examples. One as generative AI as an augment for ideation, coming up with ideas. One as an augment for reading, because my students in my online class is a graduate online class, but it's not for students who are entering a discipline specifically. It's sort of a professional online program meant for a wide range of students. And so they're not necessarily experts in my field, writing studies. So the readings that I'm giving them can be challenging. They're not accustomed to the conventions, et cetera. And so I gave them a prompt here that they could use to help them read if they encounter passages that are challenging, confusing, et cetera. And then there's also going to be an example prompt here for an augment for drafting, and that one's a little bit more complicated. So I provide an excerpt and then a link to the full prompt that is there. This idea of prompt skills, this is a hotly contested thing. Is it going to be like the prompt engineer? Is that going to be an important job? Or does it really matter? Is this technology going to get so good that we can just talk to it like it's a person? And we don't have to really prompt very well. It'll just be able to guess what we want and do it. There are some selected resources here that you'll be able to navigate, some resources for self, including our Gen AI resources and call for the Teaching Innovation Institute, but also a few collections. The Text Gen Ed Open Access book, that's, I believe, 34 different assignments that are integrating generative AI in some way. The AI Pedagogy Project, which has a similar collection, as well as exploring AI pedagogy. That's the Meta Lab at Harvard for the AI Pedagogy Project, and that's the Digital Humanities Commons for exploring AI pedagogy, as well as a recent comprehensive testing of AI detectors and a recent meta study of AI policies as well, just to kind of think a little bit further about these things. But this is an overview. It's an ongoing conversation. I've meant here to just be a little bit provocative in terms of what could be some next things you might want to think about. CELT is always open for these conversations. I'm always happy to have them, whether they're about teaching or not, if it's about generative AI. And again, very grateful for the invitation to be here. I know we're at or past time, but if anyone wants to stick around and ask me questions, I'd be happy to talk.
Have you or colleagues gotten students to generate papers and then you tried to see if you could catch it? I mean,
To guess?
yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, but you knew they generated it and you tried to see whether you could find it.
You mean to sort of test whether we could figure out which ones were generated or not? Yeah, so we have tried that. And And in fact, one of my colleagues tried that the other day with their TAs because they manage a few TAs, and they generated some with the generative AI. They pulled real student papers for others. The TAs had a hard time. They really couldn't tell which was which. And we were using GPT-4, which is important to note, because ChatGPT 3.5, the stuff it generates, I think, is pretty visible as AI generated. But you know, this is an issue of perception as well, because there have been some studies of people that, think that they're very good. They'll self-report, I think I can detect these things, and then they'll test them on it. And then it's for the gotcha moment, whereas the results of the test are, well, actually, you're not very good at picking out which things are AI generated or not. So it's increasingly getting a little bit harder if the people who are using the AI know how to use it well. And that's a big caveat. Because if you're just taking the output as it is and copying and pasting, it's probably not very good. And it may not even be accomplishing the basic tasks of the assignment or the prompt that students have been given. And this was the case at the end of the last semester when I was talking with instructors who thought, like, I think I have a student, I think they're using AI to do this final paper, but I don't have proof. And we would look at the paper, and for a couple of folks, it was more like, well, you could go through all this effort, and it's going to be a forensic case. It's going to be you're going to be a detective to try to figure out if the student used AI or not. But just looking at this paper and looking at the assignment, it's not even doing what you're asking them to do.
So either way, it's a bad grade.
Either way, it's a bad grade, right? And so in that case, and that's why it's kind of context specific in responding to misuse. In some cases, though not all, it may be more appropriate to just kind of save yourself a lot of the headache if the paper itself is just clearly not even doing what it's supposed to do for the assignment. And it's up to the instructor at that point to say, is it appropriate to give the student a mulligan, let them do it again, or do I just want to say, sorry, it's not what we're doing, here's the grade that you get.
So do you think instructors are going to have more of, okay, you're going to sit here for an hour and you're going to write off the top of your head this paper or this one pager or something?
Some people, yeah.
Blue books or oral exams.
Yeah.
Yeah. Around.
Some have gone back to that. This fall semester, some people did do blue books and in-class activities. I think that for some cases, it's totally appropriate to do in-class activities because it is useful for the learning goal. You have all the students there at the same time to do it together. That's meaningful. That can be great. I personally would not be successful, and I'm in writing studies, like writing is my thing. I would not be a successful writer if I had to produce within an hour using pen and paper. I would have to type it, and I would have to take my time to do so. So I do worry for certain kinds of assessment, if we're going to limit students to just in class, just pen and paper, I think we'd have to alter the nature of the assignment in that case, so that we're not asking them to produce the same level of writing or the same kind of writing that we'd be asking them to produce if they had access to a computer and a longer amount of time to do it.
Such an existential thing because, there's this level of knowledge that you expect your students to have coming out of your class. I often get comments, I don't need to know that, I can look it up. Right, so there's a lot of that. So at what level? Okay, fine. So there is some level of, we have all this technology that you can just produce it like that. What are you good for? So we can push ourselves ahead, right? Like you said, with the 5 monitors and producing all these tasks. But I don't know. It's this thing in the classroom where there has to be some level of recall from a person. But also, the New York Times last week and several others many others have had. The act of sitting down and writing imprints things on your brain. So the fact that you can type in a beautiful prompt and it spits out an answer, but you didn't actually go through the act of writing and researching and coming up with that answer, doesn't that stagnate our learning? I mean, so at some point you do have to retain and learn stuff yourselves.
Yeah, and that's the stance that my organizations, the Modern Language Organization and the College Conference on Composition and Communication, which is a mouthful. It's the MLA-CCCC, task force on generative AI. Lots of letters, we're familiar with that. Their stance has been that there is an irreplaceable value on learning for thinking through writing. And it's similar to any other foundational skill that we would want to teach in any of our classes. And I was talking with a computer scientist that was talking about the invaluable experience for students of really struggling to learn how to produce low-level code if they've never done it before, because they need to learn the principles, the practices. They need to be able to feel their way through it and practicing it. Same for writing. Same for any of the skills that I'm sure that you teach in your courses. So there is that kind of critical importance that means that the tack that we take, and it's maybe more of a sort of workforce-oriented take to say, let's celebrate this efficiency, let's try to automate everything that we can. But that for our goals, they're a bit different, because what we're trying to do is produce people who have those foundational skills wherever they go, whatever they do, in the same way that even though not everybody goes on to use advanced math in their professions, we really do hope that they have numeracy, that numerical literacy that they get from their math classes, despite the fact that they have calculators, which is a comparison that is often used for generative AI, the calculator comparison, right? Just because we have calculators, do we want an entire workforce of people who have absolutely no idea how to do any math? And the answer is no.
It's a good
Of course not.
analogy, because I think when the pocket calculator did come out, there was all this writing about how it's gonna, people are gonna be dumb, because they now, they're not gonna know how to add and subtract, they're just gonna.
Yeah.
It didn't happen.
Yeah.
It just pushed us forward, right? You can do stuff fast.
It's a similar existential challenge to our notion of writing, in the sense that we now have to imagine writing as something that is now always augmented in a way that perhaps we couldn't have imagined it before, in the same way that prior to the calculator, we couldn't have imagined doing math with that kind of an augment at our fingertips.
All right, well, thanks again for making the time to come out.
Of course.
This isn't going away, so we'll probably have you back when the.
No, there's going to be some really exciting developments, and GPT-5 is going to come out at any time, and we'll just roll with it, and I'll send
The link to this?
yeah, I'll send the link to this, but also the link to the little experiment that I ran that I didn't have time to integrate, but that I just was doing right there before you were introducing me, to where I told it to just generate an entire research project synthetically and then perform an analysis and give me some conclusions. So
Yeah, you too. It's frightening. It's frightening. Thank you.
Free journal cover.